Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Hello. How is everyone today? Good. If you wouldn't mind turning your cell phones off at this point. And so just a couple announcements. If you weren't aware of it, we're having a panel discussion of this book called Mouse, which was banned in the state of Tennessee. So it's during Banned Books Week in September 20th, a Tuesday here at Lunch with Books. And I have about 50 copies of Art Spiegelman's Mouse, which is basically a graphic novel, comic book about the Holocaust. But that's ostensibly not why it was banned, but we'll find out why. The rabbi will be here, Rabbi Leaf, and Jeff Rutherford, a historian, Darren McGinnis, a philosopher and an English teacher, and Judy Olsavsky, an English teacher. So if you want a copy, then you have to have a library card. That's a rule. And I'd prefer it if you didn't take one unless you're coming to the panel, but you can sign up here, and I have some copies here if you want to take one with you today. Yes. When? September 20th at noon. It's right in the middle of Banned Books Week.
Is it Wednesday or Thursday?
It's a Tuesday.
Tuesday.
Oh, is it going to be during lunch?
Wise guy, yes.
Is it going to be?
Yeah, it is a Lunch with Books program, yes.
Already good to have the rabbi because he's the president of Rotary. And they're meeting right now. So he's
Right.
He's going to miss Rotary.
He's going to have to miss Rotary for this, yes. He's not happy about that.
I think it's great.
But no, it'll be a good program. So the books are free if you want. Yeah, I know they cost about $20, I think. But yeah, you can get one for free. All you have to do to keep it is show up at the panel discussion. All right. Otherwise, I want it back.
They're going to come to your house.
It's the whole point. Get your library card. Come to the discussion. Okay. All right. Everyone, come to attention. Class, order. This Thursday at 7 p.m. at our dinosaur series, we will continue with Dinosaur CSI, in which we're looking at how paleontologists interpret fossils, because this has been a question in almost every class. How do you know what they look like from bones? She's going to tell you all that this Thursday. And then next Tuesday, we will have San Rocco Festival right here with Italian music by Ferme and the dancing of Ohio Valley International Dancers. So that should be a fun program. August 16th, that'll be August 16th at noon. Today we have Tom Bredehoft. He is from Morgantown, and earlier in life, he was an English professor specializing in medieval literature. And I asked him, that was the extent of his bio online, so I said, Tom, can you give me more? And he said, well, when he was in high school in Licking, Ohio, Licking County, he said he would have bristled at being called an Appalachian, and now, after living in Morgantown for the better part of 2 decades, he recognizes just how much of an Appalachian he actually was back when he was in Ohio. So it's interesting. We'll have him explain that. Here's Tom Bredehoft.
Thank you, Sean, for that introduction. Yeah, the part of Ohio I was in, I don't think is official, that I grew up in, I don't think is officially considered to be Appalachia today, but I recognize it now very clearly as very similar to Morgantown and a lot of other places I see. And Wheeling, right here on the Ohio, is. No, yeah, I was going to say Wheeling, right here on the Ohio River, is a wonderful place because that's what I think of in a lot of ways of as the Appalachia I grew up in, is those Ohio River towns like Zanesville and places like that. So, yeah, but I want to thank everybody for coming here today and listening to me talk about my book. This is my first novel. Back when I was an academic, I wrote some academic books, but it's a different thing, I think, to write creatively. I hope that you will allow me to say it's nice to see a bunch of faces from my own generation and maybe a little older as well. But this is definitely a project of the second half of my life, and I look forward to doing more and writing more. And I guess I would want to encourage other folks to do the same as well. But the novel is called Foote, and it was published officially a week ago today, on August 1st, or was that a week ago yesterday maybe, on August 1st, from West Virginia University Press. And I think it's available online straight from the press's site, or of course you can easily get it on Amazon, should you be interested. I guess I'll say a few words about the book and do a little bit of reading, and we'll see where that takes us. It's a mystery novel. Probably the most unusual feature of it is that the narrator is a Bigfoot. One of the very first things that came into my mind when I thought about this book was having a character named Big Jim Foote, and so that's really as much of a starting point as anything. One of the things that authors are often asked is where they get their ideas, and the idea for this book came on a walk on one of the rail trails in Morgantown with my wife. And I don't know whether I said the words Bigfoot private investigator or she did, but one of us did. And probably within a week or two, I had started writing this book. And among the first things I wrote was Big Jim's own description of himself. And I think that's where I'm going to start today. So this is the narrator describing himself. It's a little known fact that a small but significant community of Bigfoot live, more or less in the open, in and around Morgantown, West Virginia. They are, some might say, passing for humans, though the truth is that most of them don't mix very much with the humans around them. It's a small enough step from hiding in the woods in the wild to hiding in plain sight. So if you're in Morgantown and you see a lumbering great figure pushing a buggy through the grocery store with a heavy coat and unruly hair and with 2 or more bags of cheese puffs but no beer, there's a good chance it's a Bigfoot. There's a good chance it's me. Most of the Morgantown Bigfoot live a little way out of town. They do their share of hunting and fishing, not all of it in season, naturally. And they know all the best places to find ramps and morels and pawpaws and service berries. Their ability to track something, human or otherwise, through the woods is second to none. But a few of us Bigfoot live right in town, playing a part in the human community, and yet we are always at least a little apart from it, living in secret. I suppose that's why being a private investigator always seemed like a natural enough career choice for me. It's all about secrets. And that was really, as much as anything, that idea of the Bigfoot private investigator who has a secret himself, and a secret that can never be revealed, was the central idea I had that I thought, that could be a book. And so Big Jim, as a Bigfoot living in Morgantown, sees that solving crimes is useful now and then, but what he really sees his main job is telling lies. Telling lies so that the humans around him think that every story they hear about Bigfoot is a joke or a hoax or another kind of a lie. And so I thought that's how this will all work. And so I'm going to read, I think, a little bit now from the first chapter of this book, where after some introductory material, Big Jim goes to work for the first time in the section we're going to look at. He's working security for the local Ramps Festival. All right, so he doesn't drive and so on, and we'll hear a little bit about that. But he dresses in a big bulky tracksuit. So here we go. I finished my little lunch and went back to the office. I had a studio apartment in the back. I never called it home, but the truth was that I lived there. It was still raining a bit. It might get worse later in the day. I'd packed my bag for the festival already, but I had a decent hike in front of me. I made a quick change, boots, tracksuit, extra jacket in case the rain got really heavy. The backpack held my hammock and another change of clothes. I wasn't going to impress anyone with my fashion sense, but I needed to look the part. The beauty of the big, bulky tracksuit was its roomy and unconstraining fit. The basketball coach at the university always seemed to be wearing something similar. And although my ponytail meant that I'd never be mistaken for him, no one ever looked at me twice when I was wearing it, especially if I was out on the rail trail. And that's where I started out. I then headed up to the Mason-Dixon line for the Ramps Festival. By the time I left, it was around 1. I made my way out to the park at 4. I can't believe you hike out here every year, Big, said Mike Merrill, the festival organizer, once I managed to track him down. I never did learn to drive, I said. You know, the exercise doesn't hurt me either. I'd only ever driven a human vehicle once or twice, and I never even tried to get a license, though I probably could have managed it if I had to. I interacted with the state government as little as I could. Is it pretty much the usual crowd out this year? I asked. Pretty much everyone is back from last year, he said. 1 or 2 new faces. Why don't you go get your gear unpacked and then I'll introduce you around. So I took my backpack and hammock out past the little area where the Airstream trailers were all parked, and I strung it up between 2 trees just a little way back in the woods. If it kept raining all night, I'd get a pretty good soaking, but a little rain had never hurt me. I'm not made of sugar, I've always said. It wasn't going to get all that cold either if I could trust what I heard on the radio. The trees had finally started to leaf out in the last week or 2, and I'd be at least a little protected from the rain. I expected it to clear up by morning regardless. So it didn't take me more than 10 minutes to get my little camp set up, and I found Mike Merrill over by the Levengood clan's long tables, half of which were under little pop-up awnings better suited to keeping off the sun than the rain. Every year they put together what they called a ramp banquet, where festival attendees could get a plate full of various ramp dishes masquerading as traditional fare. Ramp salad with ramp vinaigrette dressing, ramp pickled eggs and deviled eggs, ramp butter on a slice of home-baked rampy salt rice and bread. The whole thing was topped off with a ramp cookie, believe it or not. They charged $6 a plate, and they made out like bandits, or so they always said. Mike Merrill was talking with old Sut Levengood himself, the old man of the Morgantown side of the family. He was at least the fourth of the name to my knowledge. This branch of the Levengoods had come up here from Tennessee sometime before 1850, and by this point Levengoods were all over Appalachia. Sut and I had a history. I'd known him for over 30 years and still owed him and a couple other folks favors for when they'd all helped me out one time. You got any of that ginseng tea? I asked him now when I came up. You just can't get that stuff anywhere else anymore. Part of why you couldn't get it was that there was a restricted harvesting season for ginseng, and it was in the fall. I was sure that if I asked, Sut Levengood would tell me that he'd harvested this months ago and kept it hanging in a root cellar somewhere. I didn't ask. Sure, Jim, sure, he said, glancing over at his daughter-in-law. Mary'll get that for you. No charge for Jim, he told her, as if she might have asked me to pay. Thanks, Mary, I said when she brought it over in a plastic cup. Sure, Jim, no problem. How's business? Although most humans called me Big, the Levengoods always called me by name. Mary had married into the family some 15 or 20 years earlier, though what she saw in Bill Levengood I never did understand. And she always called me by name, too. The family homestead was not far from the homeland. That's where the Bigfoot live out of town. And the Levengoods knew almost everything there was to know about their Bigfoot neighbors. But as far as I knew, they'd never been any trouble. They were always good neighbors to us. Business as usual, Mary, I answered. Seems like I'm always short on cash flow. Us too, she said, laughing. We're hoping for a big turnout this year. Every year. Well, yeah. I said then, I might be out your way early next week. Visiting, she said. Yeah, maybe, I answered, and a case, a missing woman. Oh, I hope you find her, Jim, Mary told me, and I could only nod. Hope is a strange, strange thing, but it seemed to be something Bigfoot and humans shared. Before I could answer her, Mike Merrill turned towards us. I'm going to introduce Big around to some of the new vendors. Sure enough, said Sut Levengood. See you at the party, Jim. Besides being the organizer of the Ramps Festival, Mike Merrill was an Airstream aficionado from way back. Since it was his festival, there was always an Airstream meetup at the same time. Most of the Airstreamers probably didn't care one way or the other about ramps, and few of the local festival vendors would have ever spent their spare money on an antique camper trailer, but the festival had been going on long enough that the two groups knew each other by now. Everybody pulled into the little state park where the festival was held for setup sometime on Friday before the official 10 o'clock start on Saturday morning. and the big music jam and party was always held in the picnic shelter on Friday night. Of course I'd be there. For now, Mike Merrill was walking me around, and we nodded at the old hands. Here was Hank Marshall using an old pair of tin snips on a Mountain Dew can. He made whirligigs and wind chimes from old cans, and he always seemed to do a good business. Across the way were the O'Reillys with a booth full of brightly printed t-shirts, stuffed dinosaurs, and classic rock and country music mirrors. Next to them was a portable woodworking setup, though I hadn't seen the outhouse-shaped toilet paper holders before. The ones with the crescent moons on the doors were traditional enough, but I thought the ones with the crosses looked a little jarring. At the end of one row, I could see they already had the logs set up for the chainsaw carving and amateur hatchet throwing. Big, this is Seth Jones, said Mike as we headed down the second row. This is his first time here as a vendor. I've got him signed up to set up for the reenactment down at Prickett's Fort next week, too, he added. And then he turned to Jones. This is Big Jim Foote. He provides security for the festival. Glad to meet you, Mr. Foote. Same here, I answered, shaking his hand. I suppose he was what might be called a hipster these days, somewhere between 20 and 30 years old with glasses and a flannel shirt. His age was hard to figure because he was wearing the sort of facial hair that had last been fashionable in the human world during my grandfather's day. His tables were under an awning too, and I could see from a chalkboard list of prices that he'd be selling food. Ramp quiche, I said. Sounds good. I'll be bringing some to the party. If you like it, tell everybody tomorrow, he said, grinning. I'll look forward to it, I said. I'll pass, says Mike Merrill. Believe it or not, I'm allergic to the damn things. No kidding, said Seth Jones. How'd you end up organizing the festival? It's a long story, but the short version of it is I hope to be able to make a little money. Seth Jones laughed. He's down from Pittsburgh, Mike Merrill said as we walked on. He says he thinks we might get a couple folks in from Philadelphia or even from New York City. Ramps are big in the foodie world these days, he says. That's what I hear, I said. He's really the only new vendor, I think, he went on. We've got one or two new Airstream folks, but I'm not sure where they're parked. I'm sure you'll meet them at the party, though. I look forward to it, I said again, and I meant it. If you've never eaten ramps, I hardly know how to describe them. They're sometimes described as wild leeks, but they have a flavor closer to fresh garlic, but spicier somehow. They have a little white bulb at the base, a purplish stem, and a broad green leaf. And if you eat them today, you'll reek of them tomorrow. They're one of the earliest greens of spring that you can eat, and they've been a seasonal staple of the northern Appalachian woodland cuisine since before the Mayflower. Bigfoot have eaten them forever, of course. I wouldn't touch Sut Lovingood's ramp banquet if you paid me, but Seth Jones's ramp quiche really did sound pretty good. I was glad to see a kind of foodie presence this year, even though I doubted anything would be as good as the beer-battered ramps that the volunteer firemen always served. They were what made the festival worthwhile as far as I was concerned. The firemen were all locals, so they didn't usually camp at the festival like most of the vendors, but they always came out and fired up the fryer on Friday evening. My mouth was already watering. I took a trip around the perimeter of the big field where the festival was held. The only road in was a twisty, uneven one that went down to a single lane in places, and I knew that those were always potential trouble spots. But the truth was that working security here was an easy gig. Trouble was rare, and hardly anyone came from further away than Morgantown, except for a few curious folks from Pittsburgh, like Seth Jones. Everything seemed to be in perfectly good order, and I made it back to the big picnic shelter just as the sun was going down. I walked around saying hello to various familiar faces, and when the line had shrunken down to only one or two people, I got in it and waited for a paper plate full of the beer-battered ramps. Tomorrow the firemen would be charging $5 a plate for about half the amount, but tonight everybody who wanted them could get their fill. When I reached the end of the line, I saw Seth Jones sitting at a picnic table with a couple of his quiches. I'll take a slice, I told him. He cut me a largish piece and squeezed it onto my paper plate, already soaking through with the frying grease. I hope you like it, Mr. Foote, he said. I will, I'm sure. I picked up a little plastic fork and took my plate over to an empty picnic table at one side of the shelter. Although we were technically on the grounds of a state park, The rules against alcohol consumption were somehow never enforced on the Friday before the festival. I didn't drink, of course. For me, like all the Bigfoot I've ever known, the effects of alcohol always seemed to proceed straight to headache and hangover, with no pleasurable interval of euphoria, overconfidence, or freedom preceding. But just about all the humans who were over 21 seemed to be drinking their share, and a few of the younger folks seemed to have had a sip or two as well. A couple of folks had fiddles out, and a couple of guitars were playing too. Mostly they played either bluegrass classics or radio hits from the 1970s. It was almost mandatory around these parts that an evening like this would end with a sing-along to John Denver's Country Roads, although I personally could live without it. And the version of Jesus is Just All Right that I heard took on a whole different feeling from the Doobie Brothers hit, and I didn't think it was improved by the change. I didn't sing along to any of the songs. I just don't have the voice for it. Instead, I watched. I suppose that was my job in some ways. Security, Mike Merrill called it, but it really amounted to night watchman and very occasionally bouncer. But at the Friday party, I probably wouldn't need to do it early either unless a fight broke out. I knew from experience that it was a possibility, if a slim one. People moved around from table to table, carrying their cans or bottles of beer, and sometimes a little plastic cup of something stronger. The Love and Goods camped out at a pair of tables and didn't move, but most everyone knew one or another member of the clan, and people came to see them. At one point, Seth Jones stopped by my table with a couple of unmarked brown bottles. This is just a little homebrew cider I've been making on the side. I can't sell it tomorrow, of course, but I thought maybe you'd like a taste. Thanks, man, I said, but I'm technically working, you know. Keep this one for later, then, he said. He took a small drink from his own bottle. You always do security here? Yeah, it's a regular gig for me, once a year. And I like the people, and the batter-dipped ramps. I can't compete with them, I'm afraid, but I hope it'll be worth my while to be here. I'm sure it will. Most of the food here isn't all that good, if you ask me. It's technically a food festival, but people don't seem to come here for the food. It's the idea of the thing. A chance to get out in the springtime weather, an excuse to risk getting rained on. He nodded, not entirely sure what I meant, probably. Of course, I might be completely wrong about why humans came to the festival. I've lived among them for a long time, but I can't say that I always understand what a human is thinking. We sat in semi-companionable silence for a while until we were joined by one of the Airstream crowds. Darla something or other, I thought. Hey, Big, she said, sitting down on the bench on my side of the picnic table. She had a bottle a lot like Seth's and her own paper plate full of the beer-battered ramps. It's Darla, right? I asked. That's right, honey, she answered. I just had to get away from that Bill Lovengood. He's got none of your charm at all, Big. Mom, said Seth Jones, much to my surprise. This is your mother, I asked. None other, she said, looking at me over the bottle as she took a drink. Something seemed to pass without words then between mother and son, and I had no real idea of what it might be. But Seth Jones picked up his bottle and the one he put down next to me and slumped off with what I thought might be an unhappy look on his face without another word to her or me. Ungrateful child, she said, with what seemed to be a perfectly cheerful expression. I didn't really know how to respond to that, so I tried another tack. Bill Lovengood being his usual self? I'd always thought of Bill as a kind of blowhard and a jerk. Some of the Lovengoods grew up respecting their Bigfoot neighbors, some of them different, and Bill had always seemed like one of the latter. He made me an offer that I could refuse, she said cryptically, and I refused it. He didn't seem to be expecting that. I had lived among humans long enough and watched enough TV and movies to have at least some idea of how uncomfortable human sexual negotiations could be, and I figured that's what she was talking about. I didn't feel like it was a conversational area I needed to move into at the moment. Your boy seems like a good kid, I tried. He wouldn't even be here if I hadn't told him about the festival. He runs a food truck up in Pittsburgh, she added, as if this explained everything. He make a good living that way, I asked, with no idea what she was really doing here. Being social, I guessed. I can hardly hear you over the music, she said, sliding down the bench. My, you really are big, aren't you, she said. I really wasn't happy with the direction this was taking. She was, as far as I could tell, what many human males would find sexually attractive. She wasn't as thin as the models I saw on TV, or as young, but she was here, and the shorts and the V-necked t-shirt she was wearing seemed to catch a lot of the men's eyes. No doubt they had caught Bill Lovengood's eye. I'm about 2 meters tall, I said noncommittally. I wondered who might be looking her way right now and what they'd see. She hummed. There's probably barely room for you in my airstream, but I'm sure I could fit you in. I may not always be able to tell what the humans are thinking, but I was pretty sure I knew a double entendre when I heard one. The hand she placed on my thigh was also a clue. Though my experience with humans in this mood is, frankly, limited, I know enough to know that there are some lines of attack that you just have to head off. This was one of them. I'm afraid you're barking up the wrong tree, ma'am, I said. Ma'am, she said indignantly, you're older than I am, I'll bet. She was laughing a little, I thought, and she had the grace at this point to pull her hand away. That I am, I said, although she probably had no idea how much older. Bigfoot are a long-lived bunch. But it never hurts to be polite, I've found, when I've had to turn someone down. She said, looking halfway askance at me. Happens all the time, I suppose. I could only laugh. Almost never, since you ask. It's not that I don't appreciate the offer, I said. But the truth is, you've got nothing for me. Well, I never, she said, but if I was any judge, she seemed genuinely amused rather than irritated. Undoubtedly, she thought I preferred men, and it was a misunderstanding I was happy enough to let go unchallenged. But I think I'll sit here and drink with you a while. Even so, she added, I don't think I could stand to have to talk to that Bill Lovengood anymore. Sitting and talking and laughing, that I'd enjoy greatly, I said to her. Let me get another couple of my son's bottles, she said, and she was up and gone before I could tell her I didn't need one. You sure you don't want some company up in that hammock? She asked around midnight when the party was winding down. Darla, I've had a fine evening, I said, and I like you a lot. But when I say you're not my type, you've got to believe me. Oh, I do, Big. Just checking, really. She smiled her little half smile. You'll be all right, I think, I said to her as we parted. I didn't know then how wrong I was. That's the end of chapter 1, and I'm sorry to say poor Darla is dead before chapter 2 begins. Jim is not guilty, of course. I guess I want to move on to the second part of what I wanted to talk about today by saying I started out there by talking about how Big Jim is always busy telling lies and telling stories about Bigfoot, and I think that's where I want to go next. I had a transition in my mind before we started today, and now I've dropped the ball, I'm afraid. I think the transition I wanted to use was that I started writing this book, I think it was in 2016. I can hardly believe it's been 6 years now that it's just come out, although I think that probably should warn anyone who's thinking about writing a book about exactly how long it might take. But in the meantime, I've had a chance to write some other things about Big Jim, including some stories, and I hope that the novels will be a series, and I've drafted some other Big Jim material that I hope will ultimately get published somewhere. But one of the things I find fascinating about Big Jim is that he tells everybody right up front that everything he tells them might be a lie. To me, that means that every time I sit down to write something about Big Jim, I'm writing something that's about storytelling. And storytelling itself, we often talk about as having a truth, but it's also about lying. And that, I think, is really one of the things that has kept me at it and kept me interested in the character of Big Jim and kept me interested in writing about him. But the other thing I think that I knew right away when I first wanted to write about Big Jim is that there were several topics that seemed right on target and so interesting for this character. One is the issue of history. And so from the very start, I wanted to have Big Jim and all my Bigfoot have long lifespans compared to humans. Big Jim is about 100 years old right now and expects to live for another 50 years. So he has seen a lot and expects to have a good future in front of him. And that becomes a clash with the humans in Big Jim's world. But also, the natural place for Bigfoot in the world is out in the woods. And there's a certain environmental aspect to things, I think, that is natural in a story with this starting position. And of course, as the story I told at the very, very beginning, Big Jim popped into my mind while I was on a rail trail hike in Morgantown. And to my surprise and delight, I've had other interesting ideas for Big Jim stories on some of those rail trail hikes that I've been on. And one of the things, what I'm going to read next is a story that was prompted in some ways by one of those hikes with my wife. And she has an app on her phone, and I don't know if any of you all know it or would be interested, but it's called Seek. And what it does is she can take a picture of something that's growing or alive in the woods on the trail, and it will identify it for her. So we've found many, many, many new plants and identified them with this phone app, and it's been really wonderful. But one of our great surprises as we've used it is just how many funguses there are growing in West Virginia. And one day we were out hiking on the trail, and here's a big fungus growth, and we thought, well, this is perfect for the Seek app, we'll look it up. And sure enough, it identified it very, very quickly, and it identified it as chicken of the woods. And I guess when I see this mushroom in the store, I'm used to running across it as hen of the woods rather than chicken of the woods. But that phrase, chicken of the woods, caught my attention very powerfully, and it prompted me to write this little story. And I'm going to wrap up today by reading this story, Chicken of the Woods. And again, Big Jim is the narrator, and when I say I don't mean me, I mean Big Jim. So here's how the story goes. I'm always happy to hear from my friend Sarah Lloyd. Sarah is a cultural anthropologist up at the university, and one of only a double handful of humans who know that I'm a Bigfoot, hiding in plain sight in Morgantown, West Virginia. This is Jim, I said, answering the phone. Oh, Jim, she said, audibly flustered. I didn't expect you to answer. I was all ready to leave a message. Sorry, Sarah. Oh, it's no trouble. I just ran across something that I thought you'd like to see. Any chance you could stop by my office this afternoon? Nothing was easier, I told her. I live in a little studio apartment behind my office downtown, and it was a 10-minute walk to her office on the university campus. I got there right at 4 o'clock, as we'd agreed. What's going on? I asked as I sat down in a chair across from her desk. Well, you know I teach an undergrad folklore course every now and then. I nodded in response. Well, when I do, I always ask students to do a little collection project. Go out and interview family members or friends, collect their stories and stuff, write it up with a little cultural analysis. Oh, I remember, I told her. I'd first met her when I enrolled as a non-traditional student in a similar class, and our first real conversation was when I confessed that I wouldn't be able to turn in a final paper. Anyway, she went on, there's almost always a student or two who decides to collect some kind of so-called cryptid folklore, more than one student sometimes. So I always keep my eyes open for stuff you might be interested in. Sarah knew that part of my job in Morgantown was to keep the humans in the dark, find ways to help them keep on believing that the stories they told and heard about Bigfoot were all lies, exaggerations, and hoaxes, that there was no such thing as a Bigfoot, no Bigfoot homelands up in the woods, no incognito Bigfoot living alongside them right in their town. So this term, she continued, one student is studying Bigfoot lore in particular and her grandfather has a whole bunch of stories, most of them involving Bigfoot sightings that might have been a bear or a human or two branches knocking together to make an odd sound, you know, the kind of thing. But one story he told I thought you'd get a kick out of. What was it, I asked. Probably, she said, I'd better just read the whole passage out. So this is a long quotation from this student's grandfather, understand? Okay, I said, and she started to read. So this is the student's grandfather. Most of this stuff, I don't remember where I learned it, but this one rhyme I have a clear memory of. I learned it from this guy who said he had it straight from a Bigfoot's mouth. But of course I didn't believe him. But he was a big guy, must have been close to 7 feet tall, and you never know. It could have been true. Anyway, this rhyme goes something like this. Ask any Bigfoot and they'll give you the goods. What's the best fungus? Chicken of the woods. I smiled a little Bigfoot smile. The old tuna fish jingle was all I said. That's right, Sarah replied. I'm old enough to remember it myself. The tuna fish version, that is. She paused, as if expecting me to follow this up with some comment or another. Is it true? Do Bigfoot really prefer chicken of the woods? I dare say some of them probably do, I told her. There are some who probably prefer morels, maybe chanterelles, but I've never heard a Bigfoot sing a little song about any of them. And this 7-foot-tall informant that my student's granddad talks about, anyone you know? Could be, I said, trying to give myself a moment to think. Maybe. I don't know why I was hesitating, really. Sarah knew enough of my secrets that it wasn't really a risk to offer up one more. Probably. Any story you want to share? She asked. She was more than half a folklorist herself, I knew. Asking for a story was part of her job, naturally, but even more, it was part of who she was. Not for your files, I said, laughing, but yeah, I remember passing that one along to a few folks back in the early 70s. It seemed like half the strangers you'd meet those days up in Preston County. They were hippie homesteaders moving here from the East Coast, getting back to the land, as they always described it. They were always looking out for authentic lore, especially for things about crops and foraging. And you wanted them to laugh at any stories they heard about Bigfoot. Yeah, of course, that was always my job, you know, still is. Well, Sarah said, I definitely laughed when I read it. I figured no one would have taken it for authentic Bigfoot lore. After all, it sounds just like the tuna commercial. I bet you never expected it would still be passed along 50-some years later. I can't say I was looking that far ahead, I laughed, but I'm pleased to find out it has been. And you wrote it yourself? I had no idea you were a poet, Jim. I never actually wrote it down, but yeah, it's mine. This guy's informant probably was me, though I can't say I remember any particular individuals I might have told that one to. And no, I'm not really a poet, or if I am, my strengths probably run to parody and pastiche. She smiled. Really, I see all my best work as fiction. All my best stories are lies. Even this one you're feeding me right now, she asked. Could well be, I told her. Would you really want to know? She shook her head and smiled, either as an answer to my question or else marveling at something. Even after all the time I've spent amongst humans, there's still some things that they do I can never decipher. All my best to Nathan and the boys, I told her, standing up to go. Come over for dinner sometime, she said. They'd love to see you, and she hesitated. Never stop giving me the goods, she added with a smile. Was it a sad smile? I couldn't be sure. Chicken of the woods was all I said. So that's me and Big Jim, and I'm glad to hear a few chuckles. I really think it should be a book that's fun. I think the Big Jim stories are a good deal of fun. They're fun for me. And I guess at that point, I will turn it over. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to field them, talk about things. I will tell everyone that I made some souvenir Big Jim bookmarks. I have a little small letterpress set up in my basement, so that was a fun exercise for me as well. But are there any questions or any things that people want to ask me about? Yes, the question over here?
I have a comment.
The comment, sure.
I was a student during years,
Uh-huh.
and he would love your book.
Oh, I'm glad to hear it. A good friend of mine has a great story about Rule Foster. And I hope that Rule Foster would take this in the spirit that my friend would offer it. And that is that my friend Pat Connor, who was a longtime faculty member at WVU, once told me that folklore around the campus when Rule Foster was around, he was well known as a department chair, was that the entire English department was sometimes known as Rule Foster's Fool's Roster. Such a good bit of wordplay, I could never forget it. But it's not mine, but it's a wonderful one. And did you have a question or comment?
Is the Bigfoot mythology prevalent around Morgantown? I think of that as more northwestern United States.
The way I understand it, and I'm by no means an expert, and I will talk about that a bit in a moment, but I think the Northwest, we have Sasquatch out in the great Northwest. Bigfoot is pretty much everywhere else. And one of the things that attracted me to writing about Bigfoot was that I figured there's a bit of old lore for writers that says you should write what you know. And I know nothing about Bigfoot. But then again, I thought no one else does really either. So write what you know might be interpreted as write what no one else knows. Now, I recognize that there are some true Bigfoot believers out there, but I am not one of them. And I'm not sure this book is a book for those true Bigfoot believers, and I guess I'm okay with that. Yeah, go ahead.
Further question. You seem in your writing to have moved the ramp culture a bit further north than I think of it more as Elkins in that area.
There probably is more ramp stuff down there, but we have our share of it in Morgantown, and I'm embarrassed to say that if you've been to the ramp festival we have in Morgantown, you probably would have recognized a number of details right down to the ramp pickled eggs. As I say afterwards to the book, Big Jim lives in an alternate world. It's not really our world, but it shares a lot of people and institutions. The university and the town, the Ramps Festival is I think, recognizable as very much like the one that I've been to several times right in the Morgantown area. The big difference is the Ramps Festival I'm talking about that happens in our real world is just above the state line in Pennsylvania, while I've placed it just below the state line in West Virginia for this story. So if there's a Ramp Festival in Pennsylvania, I figure out I can just say that there's one in Morgantown. Other questions or notions or ideas? Yeah, go ahead, and then I'll come back to you.
Have you ever considered writing about, can't think of the mythical character, south along the Ohio River?
The Mothman.
Mothman.
Absolutely. When I say that I have other volumes in what I hope will become a series, I want to include Mothman. I also want to include the Flatwoods Monster. In my crazy world, the Flatwoods Monster is kind of the queen bee of the 17-year cicadas. Yeah, the Mothman is also, I think, a really wonderful figure. The books will always be narrated by Big Jim, and again, I hope there will be a sequel that has those characters in them. but one of the things I was really excited to do when I was drafting that book is set it up so that it becomes unclear at the end whether Big Jim has just been spinning a tall tale the entire time, and whether there really is, in Big Jim's world, a Mothman and a Flatwoods monster. But then again, that's the whole problem. I'm not a Bigfoot, I'm telling you right now. And that's part of the fun. But yeah, absolutely. It's fascinating. West Virginia seems to be so interested in some of these cryptid figures, the Bigfoot, the Mothman, the Flatwoods monster, and some of the less known ones. There's a Grafton monster, apparently, which I don't know much about and have never been inclined to write about so far. But West Virginia seems an incredibly fertile ground for growing strange creatures up in the mountains and along the riversides. And I'm enjoying that quite a bit. Did you have a comment or a question?
Did you bring your book to sell?
You know, by an oversight, I failed to bring any copies. But I will be delighted to have you contact me or the press or it's available on Amazon as well. So I wish I had a copy with me to offer you. I mean, I guess I could sell the one reading copy I brought. But I'm afraid I don't have any copies to offer today. So. It is available on Amazon as a Kindle book. I don't know if there's any plans to have it on any of the other e-platforms, but it's a Kindle book available right now. And as of the last time I checked, it's slightly more inexpensive as an electronic book on the Kindle than it is in the hardcover or in the paperback form. So I'm of course happy if people read it in any format.
So are you saying that there is a connection between Appalachian people and this business of Bigfoots and
You ask if there's a connection. There's a connection in my mind. And one of the things that, again, without giving anything away, I think one of the ways I try to set up and what you might have sensed in the passages I was reading is that I've placed in my imaginary world a Bigfoot homeland, a place where they can live out in the wild, right next to the homestead of the Sutlovengood clan. And there's a sense in which the Bigfoot operate like a big family, looking out for each other, good neighbors, in ways in which I want to say good hill people, good mountain people all across the world can have family enclaves up in a little holler and be good neighbors sometimes and maybe not so good neighbors other times. So I think there is a way in which what I've tried to do is to ask us and ask my readers to think about how much distance there would be between, say, an isolated group of West Virginians or Appalachians living up in a holler and another similar group living a little wilder and a little taller. Does that make sense? Yeah.
A more mundane question. When is the Ramp Festival in the Morgantown area? I think of the Ramp Festival in Elkins.
When?
Until now, I didn't even know it was.
When?
Yeah.
It's usually in April.
I didn't even know it was up here.
Yeah. It's there. I didn't make it this year, but it's still going on as far as I know. I don't know what happened every year during the pandemic, but it's a small local festival, and it's one of the things I really enjoy about it is that it really is primarily a local festival. That is, I think there's a few people who come from farther away. But it's not a big to-do. It's not a huge festival, and it's not primarily designed to bring in people from far away. And I like those little local celebrations. Yeah.
I always associate ramp festivals with Jim Comstock and the Cherry River Navy and Necklace County.
Now you're talking about a bit of Appalachian lore and history that goes back to a time when I didn't even live here or consider myself an Appalachian. Yeah, so I know the name Jim Comstock, but I don't know much else about what you're referring to, so sorry about that. But this is, I should say, this is one of the things I'm really excited about working on this project. And one of the things that's exciting about it is I see this project as a project that will take years of my life. I want to write more Big Jim stories where Jim goes all over the state and does interesting things. I'm delighted that I've set it up so that he lives a long time. He first shows up in Morgantown in 1947. And so I have a long span of West Virginia history where I can kind of place him at different times and different places and into things. And yeah, I think that I think of Jim Comstock as a kind of 1960s and 70s figure. And I've got room for a future Big Jim story that's set in that period. So
I think you'll run into people all over the state who will give you more food for thought.
I think so too, and I'm looking forward to it. Did you have a comment or question?
Well, Jim Comstock, when she mentioned him, first, one of his more famous things that he did was when he published, what was the name of his publication? The Hillbilly.
I think it was Sunday.
One year he actually put an edition out with juice of ramps in the ink.
I have heard of that.
Post office told him never do that. They would not deliver it in the U.S. mail because it smelled of high heaven.
Well, you could probably see that I set this up in the murder mystery at the Rams Festival with the character who is allergic to them. The whole plot of that it's a little mini mystery that's set up and solved by the end of the second chapter, and it's all based upon the fact that he is the one person at the festival who didn't eat any ramps, and you can tell. And Jim convinces the cops who have ridden across the county in the same car with him that he didn't have the ramps because they would have smelled it on him if he had. So the joke about the smelliness of ramps is absolutely at the heart of that little micro mystery in the bigger book. So. Anything else? Thank you so much.
I bought a grocery bag, a brown paper grocery bag full of rams for one of my children who is a big ram fan.
Uh-huh.
And he didn't come to pick them up very quickly. So I just wrapped it up and put them in my freezer.
You know, when we buy ramps at our house, we cook them out on the grill. Thank you again, everyone. And if anyone does